In the dead center of the plaza stood the grand fountain. Its waters had been flash-frozen mid-torrent, exploding outward into a chaotic halo of jagged, razor-sharp ice spikes. The frozen spears jutted in every direction, catching the pale, dying light like a crown of glass blades. And there, perched casually on the rim of the stone basin beneath the frozen canopy, sat Zarek. He didn't look like a man shivering in a tomb. He sat perfectly still, one boot propped on the intricate stone carving, looking entirely at home amidst the ruins. He was wrapping a fresh linen bandage around his hand, pulling the knot tight with his teeth before slowly looking up. His eyes met theirs, completely unsurprised by their arrival. Rian stepped forward, his gaze locked on the old man who had shaped his entire reality. His forehead, where Sigurd's journal claimed a violent wound had conveniently hidden his past, throbbed with a dull, phantom ache. The wrapped hands holding his silver sword trembled. Zarek let out a soft exhale, a single puff of white mist rising into the frozen air, and gave them a slow, calculated smile. "You're late," Zarek said, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent, jagged courtyard. "I was beginning to think the city had claimed you." Adora suddenly moved in front of Rian, her hand gripping tightly the bow blade that was now off her shoulder and hanging by her waist. Zarek's eyes darted to the glimmering mountain wood and then toward Adora. "Thank you for returning the boy," he said kindly. Adora noticed that the air around him was still frigidly, unnaturally still. Droplets of snow and ice had somehow stopped mid-fall, hovering suspended in the vacuum. The mists and fog surrounding the courtyard hung like iron shroud clouds, completely unaffected by the wind. There was a terrifying malice underlying this encounter. She could feel it in her blood. "Zarek, what is going on here?" Rian suddenly exclaimed, pushing past Adora's protective stance and marching toward the fountain. But something abruptly stopped him, as if an invisible wall stood meters high and barred the way. Rian ricocheted back slightly, his boots skidding across the frost as he stared at the empty space, thoroughly confused. "That's far enough, son," Zarek replied, his voice sounding suddenly weaker, laced with a strange, hollow resonance. "Zarek, please, if you are who I think you still are, if you ever cared for me, then help me, please," Rian said pitifully. He could feel himself becoming deeply upset, his mind fracturing. Zarek looked exactly like Zarek should, sounded like he should, and his familiar face brought a sudden, desperate warmth to the bitter cold that hung about them. Adora stood tense beside Rian, her knuckles white on her weapon. She was staring intently at the scholar, her eyes lowered to the bandage the man had just wrapped around his hand. She could see what looked like dark, viscous blood bleeding through the linen, but the fingers were what stood out most. They were as white as the ice below them, rigid and translucent, as if his fingers had entirely frozen and lost all circulation. Zarek caught her looking toward his hand, and he subtly tucked it beneath a fold in his frosted robes. "Of course I can help you, Rian. That is, after all, what I have been doing ever since you awoke on that ridge, is it not?" Zarek said, smiling. The smile lingered a bit too long, just a fraction of a second before it completely vanished. Zarek suddenly flinched from something, a sharp, internal pain coming from his hidden hand. His eyes drifted toward the northern horizon, and for a brief moment a look of absolute wild terror crossed his face. Then, all of a sudden, he was perfectly calm again. "Are you okay?" Rian asked abruptly, noticing the tremor. "Oh yes, I am fine," Zarek replied, blinking blankly, seemingly entirely unaware of his reaction from a moment ago. "How long have you been sitting out here for?" Rian then asked, his anxiety spiking by the second. "Quite a while, I feel." "No, wait." Zarek suddenly gripped his temples with his good hand. "Longer. Yes, much longer." "Rian, that's not just Zarek," Adora said quietly, her voice low enough for the old man not to hear. "What do you mean?" Rian whispered back. "Look at his arm." Rian looked toward the bandaged hand. It was now almost fully iced up, a thick rind of frost creeping over the linen layers. The frost had begun to slowly crawl up Zarek's bare skin over the past few minutes without them being fully aware of it. Rian's initial reaction was to help his mentor. He once again rushed forward, but he was violently repelled by the unseen force. "What is this magic? Adora, can you see what's blocking us?" Adora moved forward, the sharp point of her bow blade facing outward. She thrust it into the empty air, but it stopped abruptly against the invisible barrier and bounced back with a sharp ring. "I told you that's far enough," Zarek yelled loudly, his voice echoing violently off the stone and ice. The hanging snow and suspended frost in the air stirred slightly when he roared. A low, guttural growl escaped his lips, a sound not aimed at Rian or Adora, but directed entirely inward, as if fighting a war within his own chest. "We read Sigrid's journal," Rian said, his voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of rage and profound confusion. He touched his upper forehead, the phantom pain burning beneath his skin. "My ears, Zarek. My name. My entire life, ripped away from me and carved up. Did you know any of this?" Zarek's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. A thick, dark vein on his temple pulsed violently against his pale skin. He slammed his right fist against the stone rim of the fountain, trying to anchor his failing body. "You are—" Zarek gasped, his chest heaving violently as he fought a sudden invisible chokehold. His head snapped violently to the left, his eyes locking onto the empty air beside him with a look of absolute horror. "No," he hissed under his breath, a desperate whisper meant for ears that weren't there. "Not yet. Leave him be." Rian stepped forward against the barrier. "Did you know?" he demanded firmly. It looked as if Zarek was trying to speak, to answer the boy he had raised. But nothing left his lips. The frost that clung to his arm was now reaching his shoulder, literally rooting his left arm onto the frozen stone of the fountain. There was a sharp crack in the ice somewhere within the courtyard, and the fountain groaned under the sudden structural strain. "Yes." A faint, broken sound finally escaped Zarek's lips. Rian lowered his head, his heart rising into his throat. He knew this was the answer, but a part of him had wished so desperately for it not to be true. Adora had been pacing around the perimeter of the invisible barrier while the two men were talking, her sharp eyes fixed upon the old man. She noticed that whenever Zarek flared up in either pain or anger, the surrounding suspended frost would stutter and react, as if the cold itself were emanating directly from his shifting consciousness. "What happened to you then?" Adora suddenly spoke up, her voice ringing clear. "Are you just another piece of the script?" Zarek's head cracked violently to the left to face Adora, his pupils completely dilated, swallowing the natural color of his eyes until they were nothing but two black voids. The same, he muttered, a string of saliva freezing at his lip. It was clear something within him was preventing the old man from speaking properly, fighting its best to keep him from revealing the core truth. "The same?" Adora pressed, stepping closer to the boundary. "As in the same thing that happened to Rian? Or Garth? Are you an elven thrall, too?" Abruptly, Zarek's spine arched backwards with an unnatural, sickening pop. The desperate humanity in his face vanished, wiped completely clean in a single terrifying instant. His left arm broke away from the ice and frost that had covered it, slowly rising into the air, his fingers curling into jagged, rigid claws that perfectly mirrored the sharp ice spikes exploding from the fountain behind him. When he looked back at them, the internal struggle was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hollow vacuum. "They were exactly who we designed them to be," Zarek said. The voice was terrifyingly smooth now, perfectly steady, and utterly devoid of human life. He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his hollow eyes. The words hung in the freezing air, stripped of all Zarek's usual warmth and academic arrogance. This wasn't the man who had helped Rian find his feet. It was a physical shell occupied by something immense, ancient, and utterly indifferent to their existence. Adora stood firm on the spot, and Rian turned his attention back to the entity. Something fundamental had shifted. "What did you just say?" Rian asked, his voice dropping. Adora didn't hesitate. She held her bow blade out in a rigid defensive position. "Step away from him, Rian! That isn't Zarek anymore!" she screamed. But Rian couldn't move. The revelation from the medical journal was a fresh, bleeding wound, and seeing his mentor, his captor, his primary architect standing there like a broken puppet, anchored his boots to the frost. Zarek, or the entity pulling his strings, tilted his head. The movement was sickeningly fluid, like a bird tracking prey. He took a single step forward, his boots gliding effortlessly over the slick, jagged ice that had nearly crippled them on the way into the plaza. "Who are you, you ask?" the entity murmured through Zarek's lips, its tone mocking. A question born of flawed architecture. You ask who you are, even with the help of your elven companion telling you of grand envoys and old titles. You were compiled, Rian. Every memory of the crags, every battle scar, the very shape of your skull was sculpted to fit a specific human purpose. You were to be the perfect weapon of Nostrudor, designed to march into the world and bleed exactly when we commanded you to. A sharp, violent tremor suddenly racked Zarek's frame again, breaking the entity's cadence. The smooth, hollow expression cracked. His right hand flew to his own throat, his fingers digging into his flesh until the skin went entirely white. "Get out!" Zarek's true voice tore through the resonance, a choked, bloody rasp of defiance. He dropped heavily to one knee on the frosted cobblestones, his chest heaving violently as he fought for custody of his lungs. He looked up at Rian, his eyes clear for a fraction of a second, filled with a terrifying, pathetic desperation. Adora threw her weight forward, slamming her blade against the barrier a second time. The strike sent violent ripples along its invisible surface, letting out a sharp twang as her bowstring recoiled from the force. "You have failed!" Adora screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. "Your plans, your surgeries, your schemes, all wasted. The prince remembers who he is. You have failed." She struck furiously again and again, trying to break the wall. The invisible presence suddenly slammed back into control. Zarek rose slowly to his feet, his expression smoothing out once more into that vacant, terrifying calm. He didn't even acknowledge his own sudden outburst. Instead, his black gaze locked directly back onto Rian. "The narrative requires correction," the entity said softly. Rian finally snapped out of his trance. He withdrew his silver sword, pointing it directly at Zarek, and began to forcefully drive the point into the invisible barrier. "Whatever you are, let Zarek go!" Rian yelled, throwing his weight into the blade. A guttural, mocking laugh erupted from Zarek's lips. Then, Zarek's true consciousness flared to life yet again, fighting the ethereal leash. His right eye twitched violently, a single tear of dark blood squeezing out from the corner of his eyelid and freezing instantly on his pale cheek. I can't!" Zarek screeched in agony, his voice splitting into two distinct pitches. Rian was now panting heavily, his muscles burning as their attempts to penetrate the barrier proved entirely pointless. Adora moved closer to his side, her weapon lowering slightly. "I know you want to help this man, Rian. I can see it in your eyes. But he is gone," Adora said softly. "No, look at him. He is fighting it. He needs our help." Rian began furiously thrusting his blade into the barrier, and Adora joined in again, but this time they both focused their strikes on the exact same structural spot. With a sudden, violent spasm, the entity slammed Zarek's hand back down. The vacant, terrifying calm washed over his features once more, cementing his control. "You are fighting the very foundation of this world," the entity said, effortlessly raising the jagged, frosted remains of his left hand. "A sword cannot cut the script that drew it." With a casual, indifferent flick of Zarek's wrist, the invisible barrier exploded outward. The shock wave of compressed, sub-zero air hit them like a physical hammer. The sheer force of the gale sent Rian and Adora flying backwards across the courtyard, their bodies skidding violently across the jagged, frozen cobblestones. Moments later, Rian forced his eyes open, his vision a blurred, spinning mess. Through the haze, he could see the dark silhouette of Zarek, standing upright in front of the fountain. He turned his head frantically to face Adora, and his heart stopped. She had been thrown into one of the stone walls surrounding the entrance to the courtyard, her head resting at an unnatural angle against the masonry. She was completely unconscious. "Adora!" Rian shouted, coughing as he tried to crawl toward her to wake her up. There was a sudden, blinding flash of white light. Before Rian could raise his weapon or defend himself, Zarek was suddenly towering directly above him, menacingly. The movement hadn't been a walk. He had simply drifted across the ice, a terrifying blur of dark cloth and freezing mist. Zarek's right hand clamped tightly around Rian's throat. With terrifying, unnatural strength, he hoisted Rian completely into the air, lifting him past the point where his feet could touch the floor. Rian spat and gargled, his fingers clawing desperately at the iron grip as he struggled to catch a single breath. He looked directly into Zarek's eyes and saw absolutely no humanity left, only a deep, swirling void of indigo darkness that looked like a dying star. But despite the suffocating pressure, Rian would not falter. "Fight! Zarek!" he screeched through his bruised windpipe, his legs kicking wildly. "Such a fragile composition," the entity remarked calmly through the old man's mouth. "It matters not. We will merely start the chronicle again and remove the unwanted characters from our plot this time." Zarek slowly turned his head to face the limp, unconscious body of Adora. Rian gasped for air that wouldn't come, his vision tunneling into a pinpoint of dark gray as the lack of oxygen took its toll. He choked out one last ragged, desperate sound. You stole my life." "We authored your life," the entity corrected softly, tightening the chokehold until the bones in Rian's neck groaned. "And now, we redact it." Neither of them noticed the subtle shift in the shadows by the northern archway. Adora's eyes cracked open. The world was spinning violently, and a heavy line of warmth was trickling down the side of her temple from the impact. But the sight of Rian being choked to death in midair jolted her consciousness completely awake. She didn't gasp. She didn't make a single sound. Ignoring the screaming, agonizing pain in her fractured ribs, she slid her slender fingers along the frosted cobblestones until they wrapped around the familiar hilt of her bow blade. Her breath came in imperceptible, shallow puffs, completely hidden by the swirling mist of the plaza. Zarek's back was turned to her. The invisible barrier that had protected him earlier had vanished. The entity, in its absolute cosmic arrogance, deemed the elven threat entirely neutralized. Adora pushed off the ground, rising from the snow like a vengeful phantom. She didn't rush forward with a reckless battle cry. Instead, she poured every single ounce of her remaining life force into a silent, desperate sprint across the slick ice. Rian's eyes began to roll back into his head, his hands losing their strength and dropping away from Zarek's arm as his consciousness slipped into the blackness. But just before the dark fully took him, he caught a tiny flicker of crimson movement behind his captor. Zarek's black eyes suddenly widened. For the very first time, the vacant calm on his face fractured into genuine panicked surprise as a sudden, sharp hiss of cutting steel sliced through the freezing air. Adora brought her bow blade down in a brutal, horizontal arc, channeling all the velocity of her sprint into the strike. The mountain steel bit deep into the shoulder joint of Zarek's raised right arm, shearing through the thick cloth, frozen flesh, and ancient bone with a sickening frozen crunch. The absolute hold vanished instantly. Rian dropped like a stone to the cobblestones, collapsing into the snowdrift and coughing violently as cold air rushed back into his burning lungs. Beside him, Zarek's severed right arm hit the ice with a dull, heavy thud, the frozen fingers still curled into a rigid claw. Zarek stumbled backwards against the fountain, staring down at the raw stump of his shoulder. There was no blood. There was only a dark, hollow void where the bone and marrow should have been, swirling with the exact same black and purple unnatural mist that gripped the city walls. The moment the severed limb hit the floor, the suspended snow and ice surrounding the courtyard violently jolted, crashing back down to earth. The grand buildings around the plaza shook on their foundations, releasing massive avalanches of snow from their roofs. A deep, jagged crack formed in the cobblestones right where the severed arm lay, racing toward the fountain and fracturing outward in multiple terrifying directions. Rian coughed up bile, one hand rubbing his bruised throat, while the other held himself up on the ground as he knelt in the slush. Adora now stood like a shield between him and the remains of Zarek, who seemed completely oblivious to the horrific wound he had just received. "Get up, Rian!" she screamed, her voice raw and bleeding. "We need to finish this right now!" He reached out, grasping his silver sword where it lay a few feet away in the snow, attempting to use the blade as an anchor to stand. But his weakened, starved body collapsed right back to the ground. For a single, breathless second, the entity's vacant mask shattered entirely. Zarek threw his head back toward the leaden sky, unleashing a horrific sound that was half human scream, half grinding metallic shriek. "Rian! Adora! Run!" Zarek's real voice tore through the smoke one last time, desperate, terrified and broken. But the entity wasn't relinquishing its host so easily. A thick, purple mist suddenly violently coiled around Zarek's remaining limbs, dragging his body backwards across the courtyard like a puppet being violently reeled in by its strings. He didn't walk. He was hauled at a terrifying speed, his boots leaving dark, erratic streaks in the frost as he was pulled toward a narrow, dark alleyway on the opposite side of the plaza. "He's getting away!" Adora cried out. She extended a hand, hauling Rian to his feet with a gasp of exertion. Together they bolted across the slick, cracking ice, desperate to close the distance before the host vanished. But the moment they crossed the threshold of the courtyard, entering the narrow street where Zarek had been dragged, the world around them began to violently fracture. A sound like cracking glass, amplified 1,000 times over, echoed from the heavens above. Rian looked up, bracing himself, expecting to see the towering gray stone buildings collapsing into a rain of heavy masonry and rubble. Instead, the illusion broke in a far more terrifying way. The solid, imposing architecture of the grand estate beside them didn't shatter, it bled. The dark gray stones suddenly softened, losing their rigid shape and transforming instantly into translucent, weeping sheets of ancient, melting ice. "Rian, look out!" Adora lunged forward, grabbing his heavy red collar and pulling him backwards with all her might as a massive defensive archway overhead completely dissolved. The archway didn't crash down as heavy blocks of granite. It came down as a torrential, suffocating cascade of freezing, slushy water, slamming violently into the cobblestones, where they had been standing a second before. The grand, oppressive architecture that Rian had spent hours navigating was nothing more than a temporary trick of the frost. The towering spires, the defensive walls, the residential storefronts, all of it was liquefying under an unnatural heat, pouring down the avenues in freezing, violent rivers. The cobblestones beneath their boots turned into slick, submerged pathways as the false city washed away into the dark drains of the earth. Through the blinding sheet of melting ice and rushing water, Rian caught one final fleeting glimpse of Zarek's retreating form. But as he stared into the deluge, something struck him deep within his soul, a sudden, violent rush of true remembrance. He saw falling rocks, a massive, beautiful mountain crumbling under siege, an elderly elf reading an ancient storybook by firelight, a profound sense of comfort and safety that felt like home. He quickly shook his head, violently forcing the vision away to focus on the current nightmare. The environment required every ounce of his concentration if they were to survive. "Rian, we have to move!" Adora's shout was nearly drowned out by the deafening roar of the deluge. But Rian's boots froze to the ground not from ice this time, but from sheer paralyzing awe at what was being uncovered. The false city wasn't just washing away to reveal barren dirt or familiar bedrock. As the towering spires of ice liquefied and ran like grease down the gutters, they uncovered what had been buried beneath the frost for centuries. It was a landscape of absolute nightmare. Rising from the slush were monolithic black stone foundations. The material wasn't human granite or elven marble. It was a non-reflective abyssal stone that seemed to actively drink the pale light from above. There were no straight lines, no beautiful arches, no familiar markers of mortal masonry. Instead, the ancient ruins grew from the earth in sickening, twisted angles, their surfaces deeply etched with geometric grooves that pulsed with a faint, oily luminescence. What is this place?" Adora whispered, her bow blade lowering as she stared up at a colossal, bowing structure that had just been unveiled by a melting tower. The scale of the architecture was suffocating. The steps of the ancient plazas were built for strides 4 times the size of any man or elf. The doorways were towering, narrow slits that looked less like entrances and more like jagged wounds in the dark rock. It was a city built by things that far predated the arrival of their peoples, things that predated anything that walked on 2 legs. Every instinct in Rian's elven blood screamed that they were trespassing in a cosmic graveyard that belonged to a different age of the world. But before either of them could utter another word or continue chasing the shadow of Zarek, the black stone ground directly in front of them fractured. The earth opened up, revealing a dark, bottomless pit completely devoid of light. Rian threw himself backwards, trying to find purchase on the slick rock, but a massive torrential wave of ice, snow, and slush slammed into Adora's back from the melting ridge behind them. The force of the deluge pushed forward with unstoppable momentum, inevitably throwing them both over the edge and into the abyss. The dark pit began to fill up intensely with the roaring cascade of slush and snow, burying them alive and leaving them trapped in a crushing, absolute darkness.